Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. 11 years ago on Tuesday, 19 terrorists hijacked passenger jets and coordinated strikes into the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon, and intended to fly the fourth hijacked jet into the capital. The United States and the world community responded by what the then US President George Bush dubbed the War on Terror. This led to the invasion of Afghanistan to depose the Taliban, which had harbored Al-Qaeda, who were behind the attacks. But it wasn't until May 2011 that Al-Qaeda's leader Osama bin Laden was located and killed. But more than a decade on, troops are still in Afghanistan. Bin Laden may be dead, but the conflict has morphed into something else, with no easing of militant activity among Islamists, with Africa now possibly the new front for Al-Qaeda. So 11 years on, what is the legacy of 9/11? To discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. Alia Brahimi. She's a research fellow at the London School of Economics. Professor Roger Griffin, he's a professor of modern history at Oxford Brookes University, and his book Terrorists' Creed examines fanatical violence. It's out next month. And Dr. Tobias Feakin, director of the National Security and Resilience Department of the Royal United Services Institute. And on the line from Nairobi is James Reinl. He's a Middle East and East Africa correspondent. Tobias Feakin, 11 years on from 9/11, what do you think is the most significant legacy of those attacks?
I think the most significant legacy is the fact that those attacks preempted a decade of security situations which were led by terrorism. And really, I don't think the world had seen anything like that in previous history. Not the fact that such a small group of individuals could shape world politics and world events in such a radical way. We'd just come through a relatively stable period of time, the Cold War. I mean, you can argue that one if you like to be blue in the face. But in comparison to the decade that we've just been through, the number of interventions and if you like, the severity of the response to that attack by the West was hugely significant. And still now, I think governments are beginning to try and assess, okay, what does the next decade have for us? Are we going to continue to respond to these kind of events in the way that we have? And I think that's probably, the biggest legacy.
Alia Brahimi from LSE. Afghanistan was clearly the focal point of any kind of retribution. In retrospect, was this the correct move?
I think that, an intervention in Afghanistan was perhaps more justifiable in many ways, both strategically, morally, politically, than what happened in Iraq. But I think that the intervention itself, the way that it was shaped, the way it panned out, as did the one in Iraq, was based on this kind of war paradigm approach to the problem. And whereas maybe a more law enforcement approach would have been more appropriate, given the fact that, as Tobias mentioned, this was a small group of people with a relatively fringe ideology. And so I think that in many ways we painted ourselves into that corner and we're just trying to find little chinks to get out of it. And a lot of that was shaped by the paradigms that we used, we used intellectually, and that haven't entirely been dislodged in Washington and in London.
Indeed, 2 days ago, Barack Obama made a statement ahead of the 9/11 anniversary.
We took the fight to Al-Qaeda, decimating their leadership, and put them on the path to defeat. And thanks to the courage and skill of our intelligence personnel and armed forces, Osama bin Laden will never threaten America again. Instead of pulling back from the world, we've strengthened our alliances while improving our security here at home.
Roger Griffin from Oxford University. Is he right to say that they've taken the fight to Al-Qaeda and put them on the path to defeat?
Well, I think that sort of pronouncement perpetuates the idea that Al-Qaeda occupies the same sort of political role in history as, say, Stalin or Hitler. It's an ad hominem argument that there is this single force out there that you can defeat. And, of course, what is very clear beyond the cliches of journalists feeding into a neocon agenda is the fact that Al-Qaeda is, as a fighting force, may even be on the decline. But what is threatening Western hegemony is a mindset which is actually, in terms of people who represent it, very small. But there is an Islamist worldview which can take various organizational forms and can be adapted to all sorts of different particular national and political situations. But it is a mindset which is at war with Western values, and you can't defeat it by taking out the leader of one particular strand of it. And in a way, Obama and I'm sure he's far too intelligent to actually believe what he says, in a way he's keying into the Bush fallacy that there is a war on terrorism and you can locate where it is and bomb it to pieces or kill its leaders. So I find that sort of rhetoric very sad, really, because it shows how, in terms of official discourse, so little has been learnt in the way we understand what Islamism is.
Obama did reference the death of bin Laden during his speech last week, and I guess all eyes are turned towards the end of 2014 with the drawdown of troops in Afghanistan. But do we expect a return, the Afghan jihad, to begin in earnest after then?
It's an incredibly fragmented picture, I think. In the wake of 2014, you will see an Afghanistan which is entirely more fragmented than it was before we went in 2001. That's not to say that it would leave itself open to the kind of whole-scale terrorist safe haven that it perhaps was. At that point, you had a Taliban who were very much in control of the country. Now, that's not quite the case now. You still have international forces there. We don't know if the Taliban will take complete control of that country post-2014 drawdown. There's a huge number of other actors who are playing in that country. And perhaps one of the problems we have is that there's very little public understanding of how complex that country is, how complex the history is. Once you begin to understand that, perhaps you can begin to understand what that picture might look like. I think, there have been various elements of analysis that there will be areas of the country which will be far easier and accessible to certain terrorist groups, perhaps for certain elements of training. But to the sense that it would be the degree that we saw pre-2001, I'm not entirely convinced. I think it would take quite a substantial period of time before you could see that kind of seepage back in. It's not to say it wouldn't happen.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the anniversary of 9/11 and its legacy. With me is Dr. Alia Brahimi, Research Fellow at London School of Economics, Professor Roger Griffin, Professor of Modern History at Oxford Brookes University, Dr. Tobias Feakin, Director of the National Security and Resilience Department of the Royal United Services Institute, and James Reinl. He's a Middle East and East Africa correspondent based in Nairobi. Obviously, the focal point here is Afghanistan. I'll turn to James Reinl in Nairobi. General Carter Ham, who's the head of the US military operations in Africa, said that Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, close to where you are, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb were sharing resources and training fighters together. Do you believe him, and does this mean that Africa is the new fight and the new front?
That's certainly been the shift of focus we've seen, I suppose, over the last 18 months or so. The comments that you refer to from General Carter Ham, that these groups that are based in Africa are the new front on the war on terror. The ones that have been cited have been Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and also the Al-Shabaab group in Somalia. And of course, there's been a degree of recent activity in Mali as well, where Islam has taken control over parts of the country. So that's obviously on the agenda too. I don't have access to the same kind of intelligence information that Carter Ham does. So the extent to which these groups have been sharing intelligence is up in the air. I've heard different analysts give different perspectives on it. What I would say is that what has happened over the past few years has been the gradual erosion of the strength of what is being referred to as core Al-Qaeda, the Osama bin Laden-run organization and their central beliefs. And if we are going to see or analyze what's been happening in Africa over the past few years in the paradigm of Al-Qaeda, I think it's probably got to be described as a much more complicated picture, because these aren't groups with one unified agenda. What Boko Haram want and what Al-Shabaab want in Somalia are actually very different things. So I think in this context, we've got a very complicated picture of different groups that have got their own predominantly national agendas. What is happening in Nigeria with Boko Haram is a group that wants to introduce Sharia law across a country which is split between a predominantly Muslim north and a Christian south.
So this means, James, that they don't have any kind of national aspirations, and I suppose Al-Qaeda is the quintessential non-state actor, isn't it? So are we clear what their aspirations are? Is it to introduce a kind of Sharia law, work towards a kind of global caliphate, or is it a bit more fragmented than that?
Yeah, well, I suppose in the case of the Al-Shabaab in Somalia, for example, it's a desire to overthrow the UN-backed transitional federal government in Mogadishu and control as much of the country as they possibly can with their own agenda at heart. They are the one organisation on the continent which has quite clearly linked itself to Al-Shabaab, linked itself to Al-Qaeda at the beginning of the year. Equally, they are in decline at the moment. I mean, taking place today is the first presidential election that Somalia has seen on Somali soil in a couple of decades. Largely the result of African Union forces and Kenyan forces, which are possibly going to battle them down to the port of Kismayo. But that could potentially be the last stand of that organisation. So, I mean, is there key motivation what's happening to them in their daily situation, or is it the creation of a global caliphate under the agenda and auspices of a broader Al-Qaeda organisation? I think there are different levels of the Al-Shabaab organisation and different things that they want at different levels.
Ali Ibrahimi from the LSE. What are the conditions that allow Al-Qaeda, if it's more of an idea than an organisation, to flourish in Africa?
What you are seeing are these previously localised conflicts that are inspired, I'm sure, and underpinned by localised grievances, developing a more global or at least regional consciousness. And I think Carter Hammer is exactly spot on, because over the last year, we see mainly a discursive shift in all of these groups. And I'm sure they have their own reasons, resource-based reasons for actually affecting this shift, but it's happening. And a lot of that will actually translate, I'm sure, into coordinated training. The opportunity that's opened up in Mali in terms of Islamist-aligned groups taking vast swathes of territory is very much going to enable that. And I think that Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the North African franchise of Al-Qaeda, is probably going to be at the helm of this kind of increased attempt to join forces for these localized African groups to punch above their weight and to present a concrete threat to the southern flank of Europe. Now, at the same time, what you have in Yemen is Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which are very much the creatures of Osama bin Laden, in the sense that they've learnt from the mistakes of the jihad. They see the utter mistake of having gone down the route of anathematizing the Shia, slaughtering Muslim civilians, and they've really learnt the lessons of the last 10 years and of particularly what's happened in Iraq. And so their solution is we have to start hitting the West again. We have to be controlled, disciplined, strategic actors and focus on hitting our main enemy. Now they, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, are also seeking to reach out to Africa. But the main question for Al-Qaeda is whether the critical current within its leadership can survive and whether Al-Qaeda in Yemen can be directing things more towards the West, or whether these affiliate groups in Africa will end up just undermining this attempt to reorient the jihad back towards the West.
Tobias Feakin, specifically in Africa, given the Afghanistan experience, what can the West do? Where can it contribute its resources to a Pan-African force that has Western backing?
I think in terms of what's going on in North and parts of, increasingly moving south from North Africa and what's going on with AQAP in Yemen, I think firstly, anyone looking at a situation has to remember that borders aren't defined in the same kind of way that we would expect, within Europe. The very porous borders, people are moving a lot. There's a lot of shifting economies which don't stand still in one particular region. So it's almost a case, and excuse the phrase, it's, have skills will travel, and people who have been involved with these groups will travel between different areas looking for different ways of influencing or making money. Let's not forget, actually, the groups like AQIM have suffered financially, enormously during the late part of the 2000s because of their lack of popular support. And actually what you're beginning to see now are the fact that they're being more and more involved in elements of serious organised crime, kidnappings, extortions, assisting the trafficking of cocaine, which is coming in from Latin America. These are entrepreneurial individuals as much as, ideologues. So it becomes an incredibly difficult situation to control. I would suggest actually one of the most effective ways is tackling terrorism through development, because a lot of the ground that's being gained currently, I think, in that part of the world is through this economic traction with local populations who don't have very manageable ways of making money, and actually a lot of these groups are providing them with a substitute economy which they can plug into. Therefore they're more willing to take up the ideology as well, because it provides them with some kind of basis to provide for their families, which is hugely important. And also, if you begin linking that to some of the messages that you're seeing from Al-Qaeda, I would say actually rather than AQ regrouping to attack the West again, what they're trying to do is regroup within themselves and regain that popular support that they might have had at the beginning of the 2000s. And a lot of the messages you're seeing from al-Zawahiri are more around popular support for uprisings in Syria, and also what AQAP are currently doing in Yemen is very much along the grounds of trying to support local populations, provide them with food, provide them with certain amounts of money to be able to regain that popular support, because I don't think Al-Qaeda, I don't think they're that daft to realise that they're not in a very good position right now. They've been hammered by the West militarily and ideologically recently, and I think they're going through this restructuring and regrouping.
Roger Griffin, Tobias raised the issue of Syria, and al-Zawahiri ordered jihadists to go to Syria last February. Do you think Al-Qaeda will thrive in this civil war atmosphere, and that could pose a threat for neighbouring countries?
Well, it's very clear that whenever you have a breakdown of law and order in a Muslim state, there will be Islamist elements that want to take advantage of that anarchy or chaos and radicalize it. Because, can I just add something to the discussion about global and local? I mean, there was a slogan that the Greens came out with 10 years ago or so about act locally, think globally. One of the extraordinary legacies of the late 20th century was Al-Qaeda's success, and to this extent, I think bin Laden and his immediate associates do have a major victory. They managed to convince Muslims fighting Russians that they were part of a global conflict. You get, for example, in Chechnya, where Muslims were traditionally fighting Russians, you get a very interesting development in the 90s where traditional Chechen Muslims, and Islam in Chechnya was very special and local dialect of Islam, started to see themselves as fighting for a global caliphate. And so you get the Islamization of a local dialect of Islam. And what's happening is that wherever there is a local conflict, a local breakdown, whether it's in Africa or the Horn of Africa or in, say, parts of Pakistan, it's an incredible effervescent mess of religious and economic and political factors, but there will be elements who are now absolutely convinced that they are holy warriors, that they are fighting locally for a global victory. And it's not just against the West. It's almost simplistic to reduce it to the idea of a war against the West. It is in their mind, I'm talking about the most extreme warriors, it is a fight for the hegemony of Islam to save a world that has fallen into jahiliyyah, into a state of apostasy and decadence. And so it gives these people in the most local extreme conditions a wonderful sense of ultimate goal. And that goal is difficult for counter-terrorist agencies to break down. It is an extraordinary source of power and fanaticism.
I think the most basic pillar of Al-Qaeda's ideology in the global sense is that we're fighting a global war in defense of Muslims worldwide. It's the self-defense mechanism that I think is the most important linchpin of the ideology. What the ultimate aim is, the caliphate or some sort of abstract ideal, is not really the core of the radicalizing effect of Al-Qaeda's ideology. So I think that's really important in terms of devising our solutions to this, because what we've done over the last 10 years is in many ways reinforce that narrative by launching the policies that we have. And I think that you mentioned before that it was a mindset, and I think that more than anything it's a narrative, and that narrative can be reinforced.
But isn't if Chechens, say for instance, Al-Qaeda dispatched Chechen terrorists to Spain this year, if you've got some kind of fraternity among Chechens, among Tuaregs, among Sunni Muslims, I mean, it has to be towards a global caliphate, can't it? Because it can't be towards some kind of supranational state.
I think most people actually know. I would fundamentally disagree with that. I think that a lot of these people feel besieged by the status quo and by the established order. They feel that it victimizes them. And I think that is more fundamental than fighting for the caliphate, in my view. And I think that that's why you have people that are radicalized in the West, and the causes that they touch upon are Iraq, they're Palestine, they're Afghanistan. And it's very rarely, it's more on the margins when they're talking about, how the world was constituted many centuries ago.
And what about the ideology of the Arab Spring, this democratization of say the Middle East, for instance? How is that impacting on Al-Qaeda's ideology? Is it overtaking Al-Qaeda's ideology, and is it impacting them adversely?
It dealt a fundamental body blow, because more than anything, it's not just that it was a predominantly secular pro-democracy discourse, which was very important, which is what the majority have actually subscribed to all along. They've just been more silent. It was the fact that these jihadis were saying the only way to change the status quo and the only way to dislodge these tyrants is through jihad. And it happened actually peacefully. So that for them was a massive setback. And they knew it. They understood it all over forums, and in many tracts that they've released, there is that recognition. But on the other hand, for the more fringe element of Al-Qaeda, for its more fringe ambitions, they're saying this is a great opportunity to capitalize on any chaos that ensues and to gain footholds in power vacuums. So it's been double-edged for them, because within 1 year, they have made advances all over the region, whereas they shouldn't have, because as Tobias was saying, they are in strategic crisis. And a year ago, they were almost in strategic defeat because they had alienated their core constituency, which was Muslim civilians, predominantly because they were targeting them. So I think that actually the last year has been quite hopeful for Al-Qaeda. And the Arab Spring ideologically dealt a massive blow, but the shifting sands of the region are actually presenting an enormous opportunity.
Tobias, in some ways, the Arab Spring was a boon for the war on terror, so-called, but in other ways disadvantaged it and didn't help it at all.
You know, the Arab Spring, in the end, was exactly the way you would like to see democracy upheld, which is by the people. Basically, it caught not only Western governments off guard, it caught Al-Qaeda off guard. So, okay, everyone was caught off guard, and it's more about how you respond to that, which is going to be the most important part. Now, from everything that I'm seeing, it would appear that Al-Qaeda are actually playing the waiting game. And again, don't forget the kind of long-term ideology of Al-Qaeda is a very patient one, and it's not thinking in kind of, the next 5-year time horizon. It's looking at a couple of 100 years into the future. So, if you like, within their ideology, they can afford to take more time to respond and think and how they're going to take advantage of this. On the other side of that, Western democracies feel the need to act far quicker, I would suggest, again, because there's a different kind of political framework that they're operating with. Many might argue against me on that fact, but there's more pressure upon Western democracies, I think, to be responding and be seen to be doing positive engagements with these countries. Then really the onus just isn't on Al-Qaeda at the moment, but they're there waiting to take any kind of opportunity that's given.
James Reinl in Nairobi, you reported on the death of bin Laden. His death doesn't seem to have slowed the momentum of Al-Qaeda and its ideology, has it?
I think the core group and the group that was organised by Osama bin Laden had been on decline because he'd been, had to be holed up in Abbottabad in Pakistan for all that time before the Navy SEALs came in and killed him. I think that there has been a decline of the group over the past few years, and I think we're probably getting to the time now where the biggest security threat that we're facing is possibly not going to be seen as terrorism, but there might be other threats like cyber espionage from China, for example, which is going to preoccupy MI6 and other intelligence services around the world. I think maybe if you look at the scale of the terrorism threat, there really hasn't been anything of the scale of the 9/11 attacks. There hasn't been any attack in the UK since the 2005 bombing. And I mean, maybe my colleagues over there can add to this, but we've got to the end of the Olympics, and British security services have spent many years concentrated purely on the Olympics passing off successfully without any attack, despite the fact that there were probably some jihadists in different parts of the world that would have liked to, and they were clearly not able to. I believe the effectiveness of the monitoring of digital communications and telecommunications by the intelligence networks of the West has relatively been successful. And of course, the drone attacks on leaders of these terrorist groups in Somalia and in Yemen and in Afghanistan and Pakistan has largely decimated the organization. So I think we're possibly entering a world where this isn't the chief preoccupation of the media.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing 9/11, its anniversary and its legacy. Discussing this is Dr. Ali Ibrahimi, Roger Griffin, Tobias Feakin and James Reinl. Roger Griffin, can we take the 11 years of there not being an attack on American soil as a kind of a resounding success in the so-called war on terror?
Well, I'm very conscious of the fact. While I was finishing my book, the Breivik attack took place, and he rewrote the end of my book. And I think that, in a way, we could be now having a very different conversation if something had happened. One of the great legacies of 9/11, since that is one of the premises of the program, and to investigate that, is the fact that that one attack did change the perception of millions of people living in the West of the world process, and created this dichotomous mindset where you have Islam versus the West, which obviously is a travesty. And so I would say that, in a way, the way we frame the debate is so dictated by what's actually happening to the West. because terrible things can be happening in Pakistan or Africa, but it's not shifting the way the media changes things. It needs one more Madrid, one more Bali, and we might then be talking about this whole issue in a different way. But the long-term legacy for me, and that in that sense, 9/11 was successful, was to put Islam on the map of Western consciousness in a way which has relatively permanently affected the way the world process is perceived by the West.
Ali Brahimi, the legacy of 9/11 is difficult to assess right now, isn't it? It's something that we would have to look at maybe in 20, 30 years' time.
Yeah, I think we definitely need the historical perspective. I think we always will with issues like this. It depends who your referent objects are when you're looking at the success or otherwise of our policies. Because Al-Qaeda is about ideology. It is about ideas, but this is a group of people loosely affiliated who have wreaked havoc mainly in the region, in the Middle East and in South Asia. And I think that what has been a relative success for us is the fact that Al-Qaeda has concentrated its forces. Many of the affiliate groups have been focused upon their localized agendas, which came to a spectacular head in Iraq, where there were these daily massacres of people that they deemed insufficiently Muslim. But that has been replicated throughout the region, where you have this kind of extremely fanatical, puritanical ideology that has led to bloodshed knee-deep across the region. And it has been catastrophic for local populations, which has actually led to the near-strategic defeat of Al-Qaeda because it lost the host population that was supposed to incubate it. But I think that, Al-Qaeda has regrouped in many ways, and it's on the rise throughout the region. And while we might still feel safer, we have to be alert to the fact that they are taking territory right now as we are speaking and imposing a horrific quality of life on local populations on multiple fronts throughout the region. And that's something that we cannot ignore, not only for humanitarian reasons of global obligation and citizenship, but because this will inevitably one day present a security challenge to us.
Tobias Feakin, what was interesting this week in the headlines in the American papers is with the 9/11 anniversary that they've got guards surrounding the site of Ground Zero, making sure that people are showing enough respect. And there is criticism that people in America have forgotten about 9/11 in the sense that it doesn't unify them in the way that it did a few years ago. Maybe in 10 years' time, how do you think the US and the world will view 9/11?
I don't think it's the kind of event and kind of period of time that will be forgotten very easily. Again, I think I'll come back to the first point that I made, that I think it's one of the first times in history that you've seen world politics so heavily dominated by such a small group of individuals. Well, I also hope that political memories are a little bit longer than they sometimes are. So I would presume that in 10 years, it'd still be seen as this pivotal event at the turn of the century, which led governments to make some quite extreme decisions on the basis of the actions of a few. I think one of the most important factors of this is the fact that more people of Islamic faith have been killed during this period of time by Al-Qaeda than Western individuals, and that's the vast majority. Yeah, the vast majority have been, and that's often forgotten. In 10 years' time, we will go through an assessment of what this decade gave us, and are we relatively safer now than we ever? Really, we are safer now than at any point in our human history. Yet we seem to see risks around every corner. We need to grapple with that fact and begin to balance our responses accordingly.
I'd just like to finish by thanking my guests, James Reinl, Middle East and East Africa correspondent based in Nairobi, Dr. Tobias Feakin. He's the Director of National Security and Resilience Department of the Royal United Services Institute, Dr. Ali Brahimi, Research Fellow at the London School of Economics, and Professor Roger Griffin. He's a Professor of Modern History at Oxford Brookes University, and his book, Terrorists' Creed, is coming out next month. Thanks very much for joining me on The Voice of Russia.
I think the most significant legacy is the fact that those attacks preempted a decade of security situations which were led by terrorism. And really, I don't think the world had seen anything like that in previous history. Not the fact that such a small group of individuals could shape world politics and world events in such a radical way. We'd just come through a relatively stable period of time, the Cold War. I mean, you can argue that one if you like to be blue in the face. But in comparison to the decade that we've just been through, the number of interventions and if you like, the severity of the response to that attack, by the West was hugely significant. And still now, I think governments are beginning to try and assess, okay, what does the next decade have for us? Are we going to continue to respond to these kind of events in the way that we have? And I think that's probably, the biggest legacy.
Ali Brahimi from LSE. Afghanistan was clearly the focal point of any kind of retribution. In retrospect, was this the correct move?
I think that, an intervention in Afghanistan was perhaps more justifiable in many ways, both strategically, morally, politically, than what happened in Iraq. But I think that the intervention itself, the way that it was shaped, the way it panned out, as did the one in Iraq, was based on this kind of war paradigm approach to the problem. And whereas maybe a more law enforcement approach would have been more appropriate, given the fact that, as Tobias mentioned, this was a small group of people with a relatively fringe.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. 11 years ago on Tuesday, 19 terrorists hijacked passenger jets and coordinated strikes into the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon, and intended to fly the fourth hijacked jet into the capital. The United States and the world community responded by what the then US President George Bush dubbed the War on Terror. This led to the invasion of Afghanistan to depose the Taliban, which had harbored Al-Qaeda, who were behind the attacks. But it wasn't until May 2011 that Al-Qaeda's leader, Osama bin Laden, was located.
Ideology. And so I think that in many ways we painted ourselves into that corner and we're just trying to find little chinks to get out of it. And a lot of that was shaped by the paradigms that we used, we used intellectually, and that haven't entirely been dislodged in Washington and in London.
Indeed, 2 days ago, Barack Obama made a statement ahead of the 9/11 anniversary.
We took the fight to Al-Qaeda, decimating their leadership, and put them on the path to defeat. And thanks to the courage and skill of our intelligence personnel and armed forces, Osama bin Laden will never threaten America again. Instead of pulling back from the world, we've strengthened our alliances while improving our security here at home.
Roger Griffin from Oxford University. Is he right to say that and killed? But more than a decade on, troops are still in Afghanistan. Bin Laden may be dead, but the conflict has morphed into something else, with no easing of militant activity among Islamists, with Africa now possibly the new front for Al-Qaeda. So 11 years on, what is the legacy of 9/11? To discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. Alia Brahimi. She's a research fellow at the London School of Economics. Professor Roger Griffin, he's a professor of modern history at Oxford Brookes University, and his book Terrorists' Creed examines fanatical violence. It's out next month. And Dr. Tobias Feakin, director of the National Security and Resilience Department of the Royal United Services Institute. And on the line from Nairobi is James Reinl. He's a Middle East and East Africa correspondent. Tobias Feakin, 11 years on from 9/11, what do you think is the most significant legacy of these attacks?